Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly and I'm hosting today's event. We know we face a housing crisis, a crisis made up of many different elements, and have known this for a long time. We all need a roof over our head and a community to live and prosper in. Too many people don't have this. Many people are homeless and living on the street. We're not building enough houses, and not enough of the ones we build are affordable. We used to build hundreds of thousands of council houses and now build very few. No fault evictions are back, and it's all been made worse by the pandemic. Housing is important to us in Bristol Ideas in terms of our work in future cities, and in 2019 we marked the centenary of the council estate with a year-long programme on council housing, past, present and future. Today I'm joined by Paul Smith and Vicky Spratt to discuss Vicky's book, Tenants, the People on the Front Line of Britain's Housing Emergency, which has just been published by Profile Books. Vicky is a journalist whose work regularly shapes public policy. Her 2016 campaign, Make Renting Fair, led to letting fees in England and Wales being banned. She's appeared on BBC News, Newsnight, Women's Hour. In 2021, her stories delving deep into Britain's housing emergency saw her shortlisted for a British Journalism Award. She's currently the iPaper's housing correspondent. Paul Smith served as a Bristol City Councillor 1988 to 1999 when he was chair of the Environmental, Health, Land and Property and Leisure Services Committees, and 2016 to 2020 when he was Cabinet Member for Homes and Communities. Paul has previously worked for the National Housing Federation and is now Chief Executive of Elim Housing. He's a regular writer and commentator on housing issues and led and contributed to the Bristol Homes for Heroes 100 project, which celebrated and looked at the future of the council estate in 2019. Vicky, when I discussed this book with your publishers, they said reading it would make you angry, and it does. It's hard to be impartial about housing. I knew a lot about the crisis, but what you have done is make the issue personal with case studies of real lives, as well as telling your own experience of housing. You've also provided much debate and ideas for solving the problems we face. Could you start by telling us briefly one story from the book, the story of Limara and her daughter in Peckham?
Well, firstly, thank you for reading, and I'm glad it made you angry because I think we should all be incredibly angry about this situation. But I think Limara is a really important person to start with. I met Limara a few years ago, would have been around 2016, 2017. And at that time, she was homeless, sleeping on her mum's sofa. And what had happened was that the home she'd lived in Peckham, South London, she'd been evicted from that home by her landlord because basically she thought he wanted to put the rent up and rent it out for more money. Now, of course, Peckham, and this is a phenomenon I'm sure people in Bristol will be no strangers to, Peckham has seen huge gentrification and house price and rent rises in recent years as it's become an increasingly desirable place to live. So for Limara, who grew up there, her family lived there in social housing. But of course, she couldn't at that point get a social home because there just aren't enough. And she was working, being penalized for working effectively at this point in her life. She had been made homeless and she had a young daughter, Nevaeh. They were just left in the cold. And the local council kept saying they couldn't help until she'd been officially evicted. So for months, while she was waiting for her eviction to actually go to court, she was unable to get help. She was completely stuck. And then she was placed in temporary accommodation in Croydon, which is a really long way away from Peckham. Difficult for her to get to work, far away from her family. She lasted a few days there. But of course, leaving that temporary accommodation, she risked making herself known as what's intentionally homeless and forfeiting the accommodation she was given. But it was unworkable. You know, she'd been moved out away from work, away from her kids' school, away from her support network, away from her mum, her free childcare. And the whole situation was absurd. And the impact on her mental health of going through this process. And as she put it to me, you know, being completely dehumanized and treated like crap had made her feel suicidal. And I met with her, we spoke on and off for years. I met with her at her mum's house. And to me, it was such a clear injustice and an example of someone who, well, and let's be clear, regardless of whether you're in work or not, if you need social housing, you should be able to get it. But Lamar is someone who was working really, really hard and had ambitions and wanted to get to a certain place in her career, was being told that she was earning too much to get help. And she was actually told by a housing officer to stop working, but she couldn't afford to rent anything privately in the area she'd grown up with. And so I think we need social housing for everyone who needs it, regardless of their situation, regardless of whether they are in work or can work. But now we also have this sort of emerging category that I think Lamara falls into, of people who work, maybe are on low to middle incomes, who would once have qualified for social housing, but now don't, and struggle to afford private rent. And she embodied all of that to me. You know, she'd done everything right. She had done everything right. She did everything she was told to do. She worked hard at school. She took on student debt. She went to uni, and it still wasn't enough to stay in the area she grew up in and keep paying the rent there.
And Lamara is one of many millions, isn't she? I mean, you give the staggering figure, if you include children, of 22 million people don't have a safe, secure, stable home. Phenomenal figure.
It's worth just pausing on that for a moment. It's shocking. That's individuals, so that obviously the total number of households is lower. But I think what's happened in my lifetime, certainly, and I'm 34, so I'm almost the same age, well, I'm exactly the same age as the 1988 Housing Act, I believe, which is an important point, because what's happened since that piece of legislation really is the expansion of the private rented sector, which is unstable and unaffordable. And of course, during that time, as you rightly pointed out, social housing has diminished and house prices have gone in one direction, which is up and currently reaching new record highs. And as a result, people rely on private renting, but it doesn't work because landlords want to make money. And even though they are, at this point, private landlords are really important housing providers, right? We don't have anywhere else for people to go until we have enough social housing. But of course, they're individuals with their own needs, their own desires. They want to make as much money from a property as they can. Most of them, it's completely legal for them to do so. So it creates this precarity where they see an area is up and coming, like Peckham, and I believe certain parts of Bristol, though you guys will know more about that than me. And what do? They evict people and cash in and make hay while the sun shines.
I want to come back to Bristol. Paul, we should say that you were interviewed for this book and you appear in it and gave some help for it. What were your initial thoughts on reading the book?
Well, I think it's really important piece of work. Very often, you know, and as a housing professional, we do the same thing as well. We tell the story through numbers, and actually it's not about numbers, it's about people. And I mean, Vicky probably could have written 20 books with these stories in, you know, because, and these stories that appear in there are replicated over and over and over again. And I mean, I at one point I thought I was reading The Road to Wigan Pier. You know, we just have moved on so little. In fact, it feels like we're moving back to a sort of Victorian era, which I think Vicky in her book says, you know, would not be unfamiliar to Dickens in terms of the conditions people live in. But it's not just about the conditions, it's about the fear people have of losing their home, of losing their security, losing their contact with communities. And you know, that you read that over and over again as you go through each chapter of the book. And obviously, you know, as a counsellor, I picked up things like that through my casework. And you do see it and you try and do what you can, but actually, you know, it's an embedded system problem, which, you know, to my mind, is the root of what we call the housing crisis. And we have to remember, for a lot of people, the housing market is not a crisis. The housing market is an amazing source of finance for them. dates back to the 1980s and two pieces of legislation: the 1980 Housing Act, which brought in the right to buy, and the 1988 Housing Act, which brought in a whole load of things. Actually, it's an amazingly terrible piece of legislation. And actually, Vicky says it's when she was born. It's when I got my first job in housing. It ended rent control within the sector. It took away guaranteed 100% grants for housing associations for building new properties, which pushed up housing association rents as well as the private sector rents. And so it feels like, we've been on a sort of slow burn now for over 30 years, which has led to what we now call the housing crisis. And, if you don't get angry reading Vicky's book, then really, I don't know what's wrong with you.
And Paul, I mean, you effectively led our 2019 Homes for Heroes project, looking at the council estate. It's often hard to believe that we used to build hundreds of thousands of council houses in this country.
Yeah, and we need to do that again. If we're going to get anywhere near to solving these problems, to my mind, there are two things that are critically important to actually getting us back to a position. One is a mass building of social housing, much more significant than we are now. And the other is the reintroduction of rent controls. And those two things together would make a phenomenal difference. The thing about building council housing is you can't do it overnight. The thing about rent controls is actually you'd see quite a lot of private landlords exit the market and allow councils to buy back a lot of their housing. 40% of homes sold through the right to buy, actually described by academics as a conservative estimate, are now private rented homes. So,
and Vicky, you talk about the right to buy has turned into the right to buy to let.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, it was one of the greatest acts of privatization this country has ever seen. And also, I think, of economic self-harm, right? Like, now so many landlords own properties that were once owned by local authorities, and they rent them out on the private market. And ordinary people are contributing to this through taxes, because a lot of those tenants are paying for their rent in housing benefit. Now, there's something I want to be really clear about here, because I think on the right, that fact has been used to justify benefits cuts. Oh, well, if we cut benefits, as George Osborne did, then the housing benefit bill will go down. That's not what happened when they cut housing benefit. What happened is that it's just harder for people who rely on state support to pay private rents. And so that's where we are. And for anyone watching this who doesn't know the mechanism through which housing benefit is calculated today, and you'd be forgiven for not knowing, it's through the local housing allowance. And so that's a calculation that gets made, and then housing benefit is now available through universal credit. And what they did during the coalition era was cut LHA, so it went down to covering far less of market rents than it had previously. During the pandemic, it was brought back up, so that in theory, housing benefit will cover the lowest third of market rent in an area. That was good. I think experts would have liked to see it be, the lowest half. That has now been frozen at what is effectively a 2019 rent level. And since then, rents, like house prices, have continued to reach historic highs around the country, not just in London, because of course lots of people have left London and other cities and gone to other areas. So now we've got a situation where those most in need are struggling because housing benefit doesn't cover rent. So the whole thing is all linked, as Paul rightly points out, to, I think, the obvious solutions, which are building social housing. And also to rent control, like cutting the benefits available to people who can't get a social home and can't buy a house and might never buy a house is not the answer. And I think it's worth pausing on the fact that we had a government that ever thought that could possibly be the answer. I think this is a huge part of what I've tried to get across in tenants. And I think what I see in my reporting week in, week out, I think one of the big issues we've got is that the people in charge of housing policy have no idea what it's like to struggle or, grow up in a social home, in a council home or a privately rented home, to have parents who can't worry about paying their rent. I'll never forget interviewing George Osborne Spad. This was for a publication called Tortoise Media, if anyone wants to look it up, about another policy similarly named Help to Buy. And obviously very controversial, gives people, I actually used it myself to buy a house, full disclosure, but it gives people a government equity loan and then they can buy a house with a 5% deposit. Now, for lots of people, that's one of the only ways to buy a home now. Although it's going to end next year. So I was speaking to the special advisor who'd helped Osborne with this. I believe he now works at an investment fund. And he said to me when I said, okay, I've used the scheme, I took out a government loan to the tune of like 150K, let's say my mortgage is around 200K. And he was like, oh, well, have you paid the government loan off yet? And I was like, would I have taken £150,000 government loan if I could pay £150,000 loan? And this is the thing, like, I think when you're very, very wealthy, taking out huge loans to like start businesses or whatever, it's quite commonplace. But when they were designing that policy, I genuinely think they thought that some of the people using it would be able to pay off those loans. And that speaks to me to the problem with the way that housing is approached. Because if you don't know what it's like to have very little, to have nothing, to be worried about your rent going up, how can you legislate?
I think it's an interesting point, Vicky, is also that there isn't more work like yours, because also a lot of your colleagues in the journalist industry have absolutely no idea what it's like to have brought up. There was a report recently which showed that to get into the media, you almost have to have come from a wealthy background. Huge proportion of people in the BBC and in the print media are come from public schools, and so these we're shocked reading Vicky's book. But part of the reason why we're shocked is because those stories aren't told enough, because it doesn't resonate with the sort of middle class culture of the media. And so when people talk about the housing crisis, they're also talking about, how much their house has gone up in value, or they're talking about, my grandchildren are finding it difficult. I remember I went to an event organised by one of the big housing finance agencies about the housing market, how the housing market's doing. And it was really weird. It was the dissonance was unbelievable. So before the meeting formally started, we all got a bacon butty and an orange juice. And people were talking about how difficult it was for their kids to find somewhere to buy. And then when we went into the formal session, they were all talking about how wonderful it was that house prices were going up. As if the two things were completely unrelated. And I mean, also reflects on a couple of things that Vicky's just said. Firstly, we've now got a benefit system, which the whole purpose of it seems to be to punish people rather than support people. And is one of the things that is fueling homelessness and precarity in housing. And also we have a government which, for various periods of time has seen that the way to deal with the housing crisis is to do demand side mechanisms which pump more money into the housing sector and help some people. I mean, like Vicky, my daughter has used that scheme to get housing, but the overall effect is to pump up house prices and values further. Now, for those of us at home, we can say, "Oh, look, my house is worth more than it was before." But I was reading this at the weekend. It's one of my favourite annual reads. It's the Sunday Times Rich List, and there's a graph on page 8 which says that the total wealth held by billionaires in this country is now over 650 billion pounds, over 650 billion pounds. And that's partly fueled by things like Help to Buy, because the billionaires don't own one house that they're struggling to pay a mortgage or a rent on. A lot of them own many, many properties. And the sort of concentration of wealth in the country is increasing all the time. And so help to Buy is helping the growth in the super rich within this country. It's not really helping the housing market at all. In fact, what it does is progressively those sorts of policies move more and more people further away from ever having the chance to own a home. And imagine if those sorts of figures, you're talking about tens of billions of pounds into Help to Buy, had instead gone into building social housing, that we would be in a much different position now than we are, and a much different position to the one reported in Vicky's book.
I want to come on to another issue before we move on to another case study, which is, Vicky, in the book, you talk a lot about the importance of place and being established. And of course, if you rent a house, it's incredibly precarious. You can often only get an assured short-hold tenancy, which is months rather than years, unlike people had in social housing before. And you talk about this term root shock, which you got from Mindy Fullerlove, and I was very much taken with that. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
I'm really pleased that this is something that you picked up on, because I think something that I don't get to do as a journalist often, and there is good reason for this, is to really talk about the bigger ideas, right? When we're on deadline to get a paper over the line and there's limited space and we're trying to explain what government policy is to our readers in a concise way, you don't always have the space to dig into the bigger points. And it struck me that there is something really obvious missing from the national conversation about housing, which is, what are we doing to people by allowing this economic injustice to continue? And we know that evictions have a dire psychological impact. Let's remember Lamara. She ended up feeling suicidal because of what was happening to her, because her life was suddenly not in her control. Everything that she knew that was solid was pulled out from under her, and she was thrown into the system. She couldn't navigate it because it's really difficult to navigate, and everything she thought she was doing right no longer mattered. So I really wanted to speak to this, the psychological impact that I see and hear day in, day out, because I'm speaking to people who are experiencing housing stress. And I came across Mindy's concept of root shock. She's written a brilliant book about it. And she took the metaphor of root shock, which keen gardeners will know, is when you move a plant, if you don't move it properly and you don't put it in the right conditions, it will die, and it will go into shock, and your plant will not thrive in its new pot or flower bed. And so she took that metaphor to talk about the psychological impact of displacement that she had studied mostly in America. And she'd looked at this after Hurricane Katrina, for instance, but she'd also looked at it when gentrification had occurred and people were evicted in their neighborhoods or displaced by proxy. And she'd found that people would become distressed, anxious, depressed, suicidal. They would suffer from PTSD. She's not the only person that's looked at this. Brilliant writer in the US, also Matthew Desmond, whose book Evicted, I suppose there's a synergy with tenants. And he similarly he's a sociologist, looked at how mothers in particular who are evicted suffer psychologically and become depressed. And I thought that Mindy's metaphor really gave a way of conceptualizing what I think is missing from this conversation. As Paul notes, the story is often told through numbers, and we can keep talking about this, but at some point when you're saying like 22 million people, it becomes quite abstract. I can't picture those people in my mind. I don't know if you guys can, but I can, through Mindy's metaphor, understand what happens to a person like a plant. Like, you wouldn't just rip a plant up and chuck it away. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do it to an animal. When animals are mistreated, we are all up in arms. Nothing gets people so cross as the mistreatment of animals in this country. And yet, people all over Britain are being torn from their environments, from their homes, and discarded without proper support. And they are left with serious mental health issues. And their children are left with mental health issues. A really important part of Lamara's story that will be hard to read for a lot of people is that her daughter started wetting the bed when they were in temporary accommodation, because they were in a hostel where there were shared bathrooms. And she was so scared of going to the toilet that she would wet the bed. And of course, there are people who absolutely need temporary accommodation living in that hostel, not hospital, people with, addiction issues, for instance, or who had previously been rough sleepers. And they absolutely need state support. I'm not saying that they don't for a moment, but it's not appropriate for a young girl and her young mother to be living alongside those people who have, though equally valid, very different needs. And Nevaeh, Lamara's daughter, will always have had that experience now. That can never be erased. That's root shock. And if we're not okay with other injustices, I struggle to understand why we're okay with this.
And we all end up paying for this as well, because as you point out, the burden on the National Health Service of poor housing is substantial, plus £1 billion+ a year.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, what I would say about that, and I'm interested to know what Paul thinks. I mean, I don't think that the economic argument is the one that we should need to make to fix this, right? Yes, it's costing the state billions because people are sick, because their homes are moldy and damp, or they're anxious and depressed, and they end up in the NHS, and it's not economically efficient. It also means they are displaced and they're not working because they're unwell. Absolutely, all of that is true, and bad housing makes people sick physically and mentally. I make that argument in the book because, for whatever reason, and it really baffles me, the human and moral argument just hasn't won out. So I hope that those stats, make the kind of people who think in terms of economic efficiency sit up and pay attention to this issue. But to my mind, having reported on this now for the best part of a decade, what we're doing to human beings should be enough. But I wanted the subtitle of this book to be The Story of Britain's Housing Shame. My publisher didn't agree with me. I still think it should have been The Story of Britain's Housing Shame, because I think this is a national scandal, and I think that as a nation we should be ashamed of it.
Paul?
I was just going to say, one of the things that for me is quite interesting. A few years ago, Ken Loach brought out his film I, Daniel Blake, and one of the stories in there is about Katie, I think it is, who is homeless in London and then sent to Newcastle, where she's got absolutely no family connections, no social support, anything else. And people didn't believe it. They just thought it was Ken Loach going off on one. But, as you can read in Vicky's book, that absolutely is, particularly from people in London, being shifted all over the country. And if it's not bad enough to lose your home and to be homeless, then to be effectively deported from where you live and ripped away from everything you hold dear, is just piling agony upon agony, and it should be much more of a national scandal. And every now and then you'll have something, you will have a news story saying, the London Borough of X is sending people to Stoke-on-Trent. Isn't this terrible? And that it gets 5 minutes attention, and then we move on to, I don't know, what's the latest dress that Kate Middleton's wearing, or whatever it is that people obsess about. And it's I think the root shock idea, I certainly gelled with me, very much so, in terms of reading that analogy, because the other thing is that it also, quite a lot of plants die during that process. And I'm not saying lots of people are dying, but lots of people's mental and physical health are massively undermined. It's just creating this huge trauma. I want to quickly pick up, if I may, just on because I'm the numbers person here, I guess, is this idea of the local housing allowance. Now, councils are told you've got a responsibility to everyone who's homeless, and you can again see in Vicky's book the way that some councils deal with that, in that stress. And one of the things that the council is supposed to do is try and find people placements in the private rented sector. Now, I know in Bristol 1 year, we actually went back and looked at the stats. And I can't remember if it's 2018 or 2019, but in 1 year, we managed to find of the over 1,000 families who came to the council, we were actually able to source 6 rented properties in the private sector that were at or below the local housing allowance. So the solution is a fantasy. It's an absolute fantasy to say to councils, your solution is to do X, is to give people X. They might as well say to the council, the solution to homelessness is to give homeless people a unicorn.
Let's continue talking about Bristol. Vicky, you start each section of the book with a little summary of the housing market and the rental market in a place. And Bristol is one of those sections. Can you just give us a couple of those figures for us that you talked about there?
Well, I don't have the latest stats to hand, but I know that rents, Paul will know, the rents, since the pandemic, rents in Bristol have skyrocketed, and so have house prices. And that's a trend that we've seen nationally. According to the latest house price index, and obviously this is a national average, but house prices have hit a record high for their 10th consecutive month. And Bristol, of course, has been really, really, really impacted by this, because it is a place where a lot of people move when they can't afford London. And I know someone who's just made that move. And of course, it's not their fault, because they've got to move somewhere. This isn't, the responsibility of individuals who are searching for something more affordable than the southeast, or even indeed cities in the north, which are increasingly unaffordable too. But of course, that then has a knock-on effect. So in Bristol, house prices getting more expensive, rents getting more expensive. And that's a trend that's been going on and on now for years. And what that does is price local people out. So another story that's come out of that is quite a lot of people from Bristol wanting to move to be closer to the sea. So where do they go? Weston-super-Mare is by the sea, not that expensive because it's been allowed to fall into disrepair. Now, rents in Weston-super-Mare and house prices in Weston-super-Mare are going up. So I think this story of migration and house price inflation has to be considered nationally. And I think the story of Bristol is so important because it has become somewhere that people go because it's more affordable than the southeast. But of course, that has an impact on the local community. And when Paul and I met and had a coffee in Bristol many years ago now, we also met with Henry Palmer, a local person and author of the book Gentrification and Us, Voices of Bristol. I hope that's the right title. Henry, forgive me if I've garbled it slightly. But he, are so inspired by Henry because he grew up in Bristol. He's from Bristol. His family are from Bristol. He is Bristolian. It runs through his blood fiercely. And what he has seen happen, he's in his early 20s, what he has seen happen to his hometown has caused, I think, a form of what we might call a form of root shock, where he has effectively been priced out of the market. And I think his story is a kind of a shorthand for what I imagine a lot of people in Bristol feel. And how we mitigate that is complex, but not impossible.
Paul, you tried to mitigate some of these problems when you were cabinet member for housing. Well, what did you try and do, and what stopped you doing what you wanted to achieve?
But for me, the issue, I mean, I did talk to a lot of academics and said, what can you do to counter gentrification? And we've seen it, it's happening across the whole of the world, or the Western world, that particularly city centres in older cities have become, actually in the 70s, they were very unpopular and everybody wanted to move out of them into the suburbs. Then people have moved back in and displaced whole communities. When I've talked to the academics, they said there's only one thing that you can use to counter gentrification. You can't use market mechanisms, because gentrification is a market mechanism. The only way you can counter it is by building more social housing, which is social housing in perpetuity. So not with a right to buy, in those areas which are gentrifying, because only that will secure the ability of people on lower incomes, medium incomes even, to continue to live in those areas. Now, when I came in, and this is described in Vicky's book, the council was progressively selling off city centre properties to get money to fund other housing. And what you were seeing is, of course, that any new social housing that was being built was tending to be built on the outskirts. And this, this idea that poor people live further and further away from city centres. And so we stopped those sales of those houses. And we also talked to housing associations, because they were also selling their properties as well, because the financial pressures on them was to, dispose of those older, more difficult to repair, and now to decarbonise, so that they could, by selling one property, they could build 3 somewhere else. So in Bristol, we tried to reverse that trend by getting more social housing built in the centre, with very aggressive use of the planning rules, not selling land that the council owned, but using it for the council to build itself, by setting up a local housing company which could also develop sites in the centre of the city. But it's not enough. The finances of councils, the weakness of the planning system, all mitigate against the extent to which you can do that. But we did the best that we could at the time, and councils up and down the country are sort of fighting a bit of a losing battle on this. I mean, one of the things that does always worry me, though, and I'm sure I'll get into trouble for saying this, is that some people talk about putting Bristol on the map. We must put Bristol on the map, right? The map, that when you do that, the map that you're putting Bristol on is to say to people, come and buy a house here, move out of London. Bristol's as good as London. Sell your property in London and come to Bristol. And what that does is fuels gentrification, fuels the rises in rents and house prices within the centre of Bristol. So put Bristol on the map might as well be subtitled as Gentrified Bristol. It's a real problem. The last year that I've seen stats for, over 4,000 people moved from London to Bristol. And that's quite a significant number. And if that's happening year on year on year, and you can sell a flat in London and buy a really nice house in Bristol, or buy a flat and have a lot of money left in your pocket, maybe give some money to your kids to help them try and buy a house. But what it does is it accelerates that gentrification of central areas, which basically leads to social segregation. It's a form of social cleansing by stealth, and the danger is you end up with cities, not just Bristol but elsewhere, where you either live in a gated community or a ghetto. That that's the way the housing market moves people if you don't purposely ensure that there's social housing everywhere and lots of it.
And Paul, you had a target when you came in to deliver housing, but there's a time issue, isn't it? You can't do this quickly. There's a lot of things you have to go through to build housing. We had a pandemic, but the numbers are beginning to increase now, aren't they? I think in house building in Bristol.
Yes, they are. And I know there are some people in the sort of YIMBY movement who just say, if we just build lots more housing, we'll solve the problem. But it is about who owns that housing. It isn't just about the numbers, it's about the tenure. And so it does have to be social housing, hopefully council housing, that's being built. Because just getting the numbers up, and we did have a target around the amount of social and affordable housing we wanted to build. And it was interesting, before we came in as administration, there was practically no social housing being built in the centre of Bristol. So, the planning system is quite easy to game for developers. And so they would game it and would say it wasn't affordable for them, wasn't viable for them to provide social housing in central areas. And that was true in the centre of Bristol, true in the centre of Bath, true in the centre of Manchester, true in the centre of Birmingham, and some of the London boroughs as well. If councils aren't given the powers to actually make that difference, it becomes really, really difficult. We actually got that number up to approaching 20%, which is still nowhere near high enough. But we had to move a lot of levers to be able to achieve that. Financial and planning levers.
When I was reading the book, Vicky, I thought a lot about my own family's experience with housing. When my father and then had 2 children, and my mother, they were living in Northern Ireland, and my father got a job in the Goodyear factory in Wolverhampton, and he was a clerk, so kind of lower middle class, I guess. And he went to the council and talked about what housing was available, and was actually given a choice. He said, he turned down the first one that was offered, and wanted to move slightly further out of Wolverhampton. So he had the choice. He had long-term tenure. I guess it was lifetime tenure in those days. And I shudder to think, really, how things might have been different if he'd have been in a precarious home. And they brought up in the end 5 children and fostered 2 others. And then when I moved out and went to university, I shared a house, which was fine for a few years, but I couldn't have taken more than 4 years of that, to be honest. And I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a house, which of course I've moved a couple of times since then, and which has been, increased substantially in prices, but I do think how different my life would have been if I hadn't have had those council houses. And you talk in the book, there's many pressures on housing in the book, but you talk about a number of issues, and really 2 struck me. One was those who are going to be renting into retirement, not having been able to buy a house, build some equity up, and actually save decently for a pension because their rental is so high. And the second is the ongoing continuation of inequality that develops because of all this.
Absolutely. And I think you've shared a really, really important story there, right? Because what you're talking about is what housing security can do for people. And I think when people have housing security, they can, for instance, foster people who need homes. That's a really important thing to be able to do for the community and for society. They can do things like you're doing right now, which is chair this talk and think about big ideas. And this is something I really, really wanted to get across, because there is no way I could do the work that I do if I didn't have housing security. I'm very aware of that. And I'm very aware of how much my life has changed since I've owned this flat and not been renting. And I think what I would like to spark, if possible, is a conversation that moves beyond, we've got a housing crisis, it's really bad. How do we fix it? Because we know how to fix it. Build social homes, regulate rents, If you wanted to get really radical, look at some measure to control house price inflation. We know how to do it. But what I think is missing is, I suppose, what I loosely call in the book, the politics of the politics of possibility. It's 2022. You know, I have a phone in my pocket that is more powerful than the computer that sat downstairs in my parents' house when I was a kid. Look at how far we have come in such a short space of time. We can go to the moon pretty easily. That has happened in my dad's lifetime. And yet, we can't house people. And in doing so, by allowing this crisis to continue and allowing precarity and instability and all of the pain that causes for people to continue, we're keeping people oppressed. I really think that. And I want to talk about the intersectionality of this, right? Who's hit the hardest? People on low incomes, people of color, women, particularly women with children who are parenting on their own. We are keeping people subjugated and oppressed, and we are denying them the opportunity to do great things. And by great things, I don't mean like become entrepreneurs and make loads of money, although they may well go on to do that. I mean, support their community, foster other people's kids, help out, contribute great ideas, open, community centers. Like, the possibilities of what we could do as a society if we just gave everyone a home are endless. And I think we would immediately, overnight, just erase so many harms, so many social harms, and it would have a direct impact on so many other policy areas, right? Like, that's also what's so important here. This is about social justice, because it's also about what happens at the Department of Work and Pensions with the benefits bill and people who are struggling to make ends meet. And it's also about what happens with crime and young people falling into crime. And we talk about that as though it's not related to housing. It's related to gender equality. And yet we talk about the housing crisis as though it's not directly related to the fact that women and men still don't have parity. But of course, if men on average earn more than women and housing keeps getting more expensive, women are going to suffer more. It's related to race, of course. You know, Black people are more likely to become homeless than white people. If we made sure that everyone had a stable home, we would go some way towards sorting out the issue of racism. Because if you give people a stable base, then at least they can work out from there. So I think that, is really what I hope this book gets across, because I think it's important to have the detailed policy discussions. But like Paul, week in, week out, I go to these events and people talk about the housing market and they talk about the benefit system. They talk about building social housing as though it's all in the abstract. And it's not. We're cutting people off at the knees in life and stopping them from doing whatever it is they want to do. And I think that is so basic, but it's also, to me, such an exciting and positive thing to take away from what might happen if we actually gave people true housing choices like the one you just described. Because who knows what they'd come up with? Like I said, we can go to space now. My iPhone is more powerful than the computers that we had 10 years ago. And that's getting smaller and smaller, and it sits in my pocket. And in 10 years' time, probably won't even have a phone, just like a chip in our brains or whatever. I don't know. I actually don't particularly want that to happen. But my point is that we're not progressing. Humanity is not progressing. All the while we keep people oppressed and poor and unwell because something as basic as shelter can't be guaranteed.
And Paul, Vicky talks about the need to embrace idealism. What do you want? What would you need to deliver the kind of housing program you want to do?
I mean, it's really boring, isn't it? Because what I think the answers are exactly the same as what Vicky's been saying now. I mean, the first thing we need some humanity when we're looking at social policy. Well, I mean, one of the things that housing people say is there's no point talking to whoever the government housing minister is about housing policy, because they ain't going to be there longer than 9 months on average. And also they've actually got no power, because all the decisions on housing policy are made in the Treasury. And therefore, and which, you know, I mean, I'm sure people are wrong, but they feel that, you know, the Treasury is not human in the way that it operates and makes decisions. It's looking at markets, and it's looking at tax income, and it's looking at trade figures, and it's not looking at the sort of people and the sort of stories that you see in Vicky's book. And, you know, you can imagine even amongst civil servants in the Department of Levelling Up might read Vicky's book, but I bet you civil servants in the Treasury don't, and would have no real understanding of it. So the answer is really clear. We have to build lots more social housing. We have to bring in rent controls. I'm really worried, actually, that people get a bit carried away. The government have just published a bill where they're going to take away Section 21 no-fault divorces, no-fault evictions. And as if that solves the problem. But actually, the government have also said they're going to make it easier to evict people because of rent arrears. There's no control on private sector rents. So if as a landlord you want to get rid of somebody, you just bump up their rent, force them into arrears, you evict them. They've got no legal right to be rehoused because they're intentionally homeless, because they made themselves homeless because they didn't pay their rent. And they've also got a huge debt hanging over them. So there's a danger that if you don't do all the things at the same time, you actually make the position worse. So rent controls is absolutely crucial. And, you know, initially what you'd want is councils to be able to enter the market and buy up those council houses that were sold, and which, not the ones that are owned by the people who bought them and are continuing to live in them, but the 40%, over 1 million council homes that are now in the ownership of private landlords. And, you know, you could start to move things very quickly. You need to change the planning rules so that developers can wriggle out of providing social housing. And so one of the ways they do it is by putting a very high spec on their building, making it, you know, very expensive and exclusive, and then saying that, well, we can't afford to provide any social housing because it costs so much for us to build it at this high spec. So then there needs to be much more power in the planning system to deal with this. You need a benefit system which actually supports people. I mean, it's supposed to be a safety net, but it's a safety net with no netting across it. Is, you know, something that lots of people fall through. I was talking to somebody who lives in one of our homes on Monday. He's got no job because he used to work for his dad, and his mum and dad are split up, and his dad's disappeared, so he can't work for his dad anymore. He can't face claiming benefit in universal credit. He just can't cope with it. So he's somebody who's basically fallen completely through the cracks. He's got no income whatsoever. He lives on what people in his family or other people that he knows will make available to him, because the collective of the systems is so oppressive that people don't enter it. And, you know, there's an increasing number of people, I think, in that position as well. So we have to join up all these different things. It's not hard. The barrier to a lot of this is the mindset of the Treasury. And I think that's true of whoever's in government. I mean, the housing crisis has been building for 40 years. It's not something that just happened yesterday, or even in 2010 when the coalition was elected. Those reforms from the 1988 Housing Act, the loss of the fair rent, was not reversed by the you know, the long Blair and Brown governments. It could, you know, so it's not about saying, you know, it's all down to one party. All the three main parties in this country have been in power during this period, and none of them have really managed to deal with it.
Vicky, reading your book, it's packed full of solutions. You know that the ideas are there and the solutions are there. That there seems to be the lack of will in national government, as Paul has been talking about there. Do you have any hope that someone like Michael Gove will change things, particularly in terms of the levelling up agenda?
Well, I've given him a copy of the book. But do I have any hope? Well, yes, I think it's always important to
have you
have
given it to Rishi Sunak?
I'm trying to get it into his hands. Because you're quite right. Like, the left hand in government has to know what the right is doing. And I think often, I mean, let's take the pandemic stamp duty cut, which is part of the reason house prices are so inflated at the moment, although not the whole picture. What's the point of all of these policies if we're going to have the Treasury pouring petrol on house prices? But I think, do I have hope? Yes, because you have to. And I don't think that means being Pollyanna-ish and thinking that it will be easy. I don't think it means a naive hope, like, oh, if I just sit here, everything will work itself out. But I think you have to have hope that in the end, someone will see sense. I think Gove is across this agenda. I think he understands it better than most. I think he has done the reading and talked to the right people. He's listening to experts, despite his EU referendum comment about how people have had enough of experts. And I think that is something. But what it would take is a mindset shift in Westminster. And there's a bigger problem here too, which is that the housing market is a really, really big driver of our GDP. We don't really make that much in this country anymore. And actually, for financial services, mortgage lending and servicing loans is pretty lucrative. That's another big problem that we've got. But I remain hopeful that change is possible. And the reason that I have that hope is not because of what I see in Westminster and, Michael Gove saying all the right things. It's because of the people I meet every day who, even though they've been at the sharp end of this, want to tell their story, want to make a difference, want to vote in a way that is going to change things, not for them, but so that no one ever has to go through what they went through. And everyone I spoke to for tenants, and as you alluded to earlier, there could have been hundreds and hundreds of people in this book. And they've all said similar things to me, which is like, I want to talk about this so it doesn't happen to anyone else. And I think eventually public opinion is going to get to the point where politicians can't ignore this issue anymore. And that's how politics works. That is how ideas get to the mainstream. That is how the Overton window, as political scientists like to call it, shifts. Politicians have to get elected. So they'll do what people want. And we know from the polling, since the pandemic, there are more people in favor of the welfare state than there have been in decades. So I think things are moving and I think things are changing. And I think we've seen during the pandemic what a groundswell of people coming together in coalition really can do. And I think that's really what I took away from quite rightly, the attention that Black Lives Matter got after the murder of George Floyd. Black Lives Matter was not a new movement. It was not a new concept. Anti-racism is not a new thing. But enough people came together around a particular event to really push that conversation forward. So I think whatever the issue is, it's possible. And that's what gives me hope, is just seeing how people respond when they've had enough. And I think with housing, we're reaching, it feels to me like we're reaching a tipping point based on the stories I'm hearing and what I'm seeing when I'm out and about. And I think if enough people could come together around the issue, and I understand why it's challenging because it's so complex, and it's like local housing allowance, Section 106, this housing act, that housing act. It's like, what is going on? So that's why we just have to boil it down. Like, everyone needs a home. So let's sort that out and then we can all move on.
I think it's really great to see organisations like Acorn, people come in, Acorn in Bristol, which is now a national movement, coming together to give renters a voice and, to basically build, grassroots unions. But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, part of the response of the government to knowing that they're losing votes amongst private renters is just to make it more difficult for them to vote. It's, bringing in ID rules on voting, for example, which they know will hit the poorest much more, and all that intersectionality, all the groups that are going to be less likely to vote as a result of those changes are, young single women, people from ethnic minority communities, people with poor mental health, and a whole load of other groups of people. Wealthy people have all got passports, and most of them have got driving licenses, and are used to carrying ID around with them everywhere. Lots of poor people haven't got those sorts of ID, and in fact, some of them are quite worried about carrying ID around with them, particularly, government looking at increasing stop and search, for example, unfettered by the police. I'm not as optimistic as Vicky, maybe because I'm older and I've seen that the answers have been there for a long time and people haven't grasped them. And so I really do worry. I mean, I do agree. Michael Gove is saying all the right things, but when we have the Chancellor announcing how he's going to deal with the cost of living crisis, one of the greatest things he could do in terms of dealing with the cost of living crisis, or two of them, are one, building more social housing so people have got rents which they genuinely can afford, and the other is ensuring that the social housing that does exist is well insulated so it doesn't cost so much to heat. And those things aren't there.
And rent control.
And rent control, absolutely. So I'm still worried, and I am worried that our democracy is under attack as well, because those in power feel that maybe things are moving against them, may feel that maybe they're threatened, and the way to deal with that is to fix the system.
We're going to have to close it there, I'm afraid. But just before we do, Vicky, one of the encouraging things in the book is Lamara, because she ends up helping people with housing problems, doesn't she?
Yeah, so Lamara is now a housing officer at the very council that didn't adequately help her. So while I share, Paul, I really do share your worries, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that a lot of this is ideological, because yes, it could be fixed. And we used to have rent control. Now we don't have it. That's political. That's ideological. But I think, it's not large scale policy change, but the fact that Lamara now does that job, and I'm sure there are many people out there like her, the fact that you do your job, that is what change looks like. That is what progress looks like. And she will take the atrocious experience she had, and she will make sure that everyone she encounters as a housing officer is treated with humanity. And knowing her, I have every confidence that she will change things from the inside too. So I don't think all is lost, but I agree with Paul. I do think there's serious cause for concern. And I think, even down to the fact that the cost of essentials are rising beyond what people can afford. I refuse to call it a cost of living crisis, because I think that again detaches us from what it is. The cost of essentials are rising beyond what people can afford. People are choosing between paying their rent and paying their bills. It's not an abstract existential question about what the cost of living is. It's very, very real. And rent is not measured properly. The ONS index of rents is an experimental index, because there's no central register of rents like there is of house prices. So the truth is, we actually don't know how much people's rents are going up by right now. And that's not factored in to CPI, consumer price inflation. So I think, I'm not an economist, but I think, the true scale of inflation could be far, far higher if you factored in what's happening with private rents. And if we don't have the data, if we're not counting it, we don't have to do anything about it, do we?
Well, one thing that people can do is read Vicky's book, which is an important book. And as Paul is showing us there, and I very much hope that Michael Gove does read it and you manage to get a copy into the hands of Rishi Sunak as well. It should be sent to them all, in fact, I think. Tenants is published by Profile Books and is available now. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Paul, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.